Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is William Evans. So I co-founded Black Nerd Problems with one of my best friends, Omar Holman, and we met. Actually, we're both writers, we're both poets, and we met at what's called the National Poetry Slam back in 2008, I think. And we just are both nerds as well, right? So we shared in a bunch of different interests and things like that, whether it be, comic books or, movies and things like that. And we basically, Black Nerd Problems started because, we'd be listening to something or watching something or something would happen in kind of nerd culture or pop culture where people would be up in arms about something that was, diversity, right? Something like that happening. But it wasn't just that we wanted to talk about. It was actually the way that it was always being covered, right? And I remember I tell people this kind of about our origin story in that I used to listen to this podcast that talked about TV shows every week, right? And very funny, entertaining guys. And they were talking about Mad Men, which I used to watch when it was on. And anyone familiar with that show, Mad Men? So, back in the later seasons of Mad Men, when they discovered black people, so they had some, there's this really poignant scene with one of the secretaries in the office who was black, and she has this weird interaction with one of the cast member, one of the people that was part of the firm, and it was a very big touch point moment for race and kind of this self-explanatory, and it was up for debate for if the show handled it well, right? Or, was this a realistic situation? Could they have leaned into it more, that kind of a thing? And so the two guys I still listen to right now, they're both white males on the podcast, and they were like, yeah, I don't know if Matt Weiner handled that correctly. And they spent about 20 seconds on that and they moved off. I'm like, no, that's actually what I'm interested in. That's actually what I want to hear about. And I kept running across more of those moments where I had an investment in something that maybe not necessarily a lot of the media that I was consuming did. And I was like, man, maybe we should become part of the conversation. So that's kind of where Black Nerd Problems came from. It started out with two of us kind of creating it. And now, almost 3 years later, actually our 3-year anniversary comes up next month. 3 years later, we got about 25 contributors on the site now from across the country. That is very cool because a lot of them have interest in stuff that I have no interest in, but I'm glad it's on the site, right? So as far as this talk, when I was looking at this, I was looking at the theme of Beyond. Obviously, talking about TV shows and different media like that, like I'm very invested in storytelling. I'm a storyteller myself. And those are the things that hook me, right? So you can do a lot, like you can have a really bad, your video game's graphics could be garbage, but if it's got a good story, I'll probably still pour like 30 hours into it, right? So storytelling is kind of where I'm at. So when I look at that, I'm moving to the next slide. So when I'm looking at storytelling now, I feel like we tread a lot of the same ground, right? And there's a lot of security in that. There's a lot of security in that, obviously. It comes from, a lot of it's financial. A lot of it is making sure that you're rewarding people that know a source material, right? So that's why I like all the comic book movies. So like I think the newest trailer is like Thor Ragnarok, right? That story comes from 2004. Right? The Avengers movies, those stories come from well before, right? And so as a someone that ingests a lot of this media now and reads comic books now, I'm like, man, there's some great stories that have come out in the last couple of years. Why are we not hearing these stories? Well, because there's a familiarity, right? And there's a familiarity in terms of, okay, this story has been vetted, right? You know, a lot of people bought into it, and we're going to get all the comic book nerds because like, oh my God, I know that story, and this is, you know, and it generates that kind of buzz. So I think that's why we end up getting a lot of these repeats of stories. TV shows that are new versions of older failed TV shows, right? There's always a new Chicago pilot that's either a cop show or a hospital, right? There's always a new hospital show, and then, of course, the great marketing genius of prequels, right? So it doesn't matter if you have a great story that took you 3 movies to tell, then you can probably do it in 3 more movies before the first movies happened, right? So these are kind of like the boxes that we find ourselves in. And there's also this pressure to stay committed to the source material as well. And the interesting thing about source material, so I get in a lot of arguments with people about when it comes to diversity, and like comic books is a big one. I don't know why comic books has this like gatekeeper mentality of nothing can be changed. But like I got into an argument with someone online on Tumblr, as you do, right? And so I don't understand, like, you know, someone says something about Superman being black, right? I just can't see Superman as black, right? Superman's never been black. Why would that make sense? And I'm like, well, if you're going to argue that a character should always be the way a character has been, and that character was created when people like me couldn't even sit at the front of the bus, I'm going to ask you to reevaluate what that origin actually is, right? So when you look at the time frame when these stories were told and this pressure to stay committed to the source material, there was big news made with, keep our on comic books. There's big news made with Marvel a couple weeks ago because one of the executives said sales were hurting, and he basically blamed that Marvel's initiative towards diversity of having more women and more people of color led comic books, and he paralleled that to Marvel's decline in sales, right? And so he's like, oh, well, I guess, you know, that was a failed experiment, right? Is kind of what the take on that was. And so there's a pressure to stay committed to a specific type of source material, which usually is a financial one. So in terms of, that's kind of where we're at right now. And it also speaks to a limit of imagination, right? So there's a famous story that kind of circulates about Naz Humphreys, and who's a British actress who showed up to, I think it was the newer trilogy. It wasn't the Hobbit trilogy. And she just wanted to be one of the extras as a Hobbit, and she was told she was too dark to be one of the Hobbits, which is amazing because Hobbits aren't real people. So it's this situation of, even in fantasy and sci-fi, that we have this very limited scope, and I understand where it comes from in terms of relatability, right? So if I tell you I'm going to make this movie about going, you know, to outer space and seeing things that we've never seen before, to root it in something, you know, maybe these people need to still be humanoid in some aspect, right? Like, that always bothered me. Like movies like, who remembers seeing like Signs for the first time, right? Sorry if I'm going to spoil this movie for you. But like, Signs was an amazing, like, tension-filled movie, and then you see the alien. And the alien looks like a really elongated version of us. And I was like, it just looks like a dude, man, right? And so, like, limiting our imagination for these kind of things, one, you know, the racial identity of hobbits, right? This was another one that came out. I remember I wrote an article on the website about this. So here's a question. Has anyone ever read a James Bond novel? That's awesome. You are like the first ones I've met that have done that. And that's not to shade you for reading James Bond novels, but that's just not a thing I knew people did. Anthony Horowitz, who recently took over writing these novels, I don't know if he's released any of these novels yet, writing James Bond novels. I remember he was asked about Idris Elba because being the new Bond, and this has been like this big discussion point for years. He's like, Idris feels like he's too street to play Bond. Too street. It's like, have you met Idris Elba? Have you seen Idris Elba? Right? And James Bond, again, a fictional character. Why can't James Bond look like Idris Elba or act like Idris Elba, right? And so this is kind of this limited imagination that we've kind of been structured with. And then Doctor Who, right? Like, so any big Doctor Who fans in the room? Not so much, huh? But people are aware of Doctor Who. So even if you don't know Doctor Who, you know what Doctor Who looks like, because Doctor Who has always looked like the same kind of person throughout its history, right? And it's always been a white male. And Doctor Who is an alien, right? There's nothing intrinsically that he needs to look like that. And then when they had this new Doctor Who, there's this big hoopla made about it, like, oh my goodness, Doctor Who. I think Idris was up for that or consideration. I think a lot of British actresses were in consideration for that, like, oh my goodness, Doctor Who might be a woman. No, Peter Capaldi, no, not so much. So there's this limited imagination in terms of what we've been doing with storytelling, and that we've kind of got these boxes that we're still trying to expand out of. So when I look at how do we go beyond? How do we get out of these boxes that we're currently in terms of the stories that we tell, and how do these things become bigger to a mass market, so to speak? And I think the first thing is we have to start looking at things from new perspectives. We need new people in the roles of those storytellers, right? And it doesn't have to be confined to, oh, okay, so we've traditionally had a man in this role, so we'll put a woman there. Or it's traditionally been a white guy in this role, so we'll put a black guy there, right? Like, there are so many different identities that we can tap into, whether that is able-bodied, whether that is, like, a big thing for me is language. It astounds me. Any Walking Dead fans in the room? Yeah? So here's a question. Are there no Spanish-speaking individuals on The Walking Dead because their survivability would go lower because they're not relating to other people and the people that speak English wouldn't care? Or they just not have the imagination to mix more of those people in, right? I think there was like one episode where someone on there where English wasn't their first language and then they died, right? Like, is that like supposed to be indicative of something? But, you know, so I think we need to like change the perspective in terms of the guise of where these stories are being told from, right? Time travel is amazing to me, right? Because we see so many shows where someone goes back in time, right? And what's like the number one thing that people always want to get rid of? Like, oh, we have to kill Hitler, right? Like, if we're going to go back in time, and we're going to change the course of things, then we have to go kill Hitler. No one ever like wants to stop slavery. No one ever looks at some of these other things that we deal with as stopping that. So that always amazed me for time travel. That never really gets touched on. And then again, like when we're talking about beyond, and we're talking about, it could be sci-fi or fantasy, first contact, right? Like, who gets to represent us, right? In terms of, so if we build some movie where, you know, we travel to another dimension, another space or whatever, who's our first representative? Who is that protagonist in that story, right? And expanding that a little bit more in terms of who could represent us. Because I think that's a very big thing. And I think that goes into a lot of thought process when people are building these stories. It's like, okay, well, this is the avatar for, you know, Earth or whatever that story might be. But I think we need to expand that scope a little bit in terms of who gets to represent us and what our population actually looks like. I talk about this as well. So Star Wars has a black woman problem because they don't have many of them. Rogue One, there's all the trailers. And so I remember there's so many people on my site, and I have like a few women that are like huge Star Wars fans and went and saw Rogue One day one and blah, blah, blah. And so this trailer comes out and it's like, oh my God, there's a black woman speaking in a Star Wars film. Think about the last time you've seen that, because you haven't. And so it's like, oh my goodness, looks like a pretty prominent role. She probably gets about a grand total, maybe about 5 minutes of screen time, maybe. 2 of that is speaking, right? And there are more races of aliens in Star Wars than there are black women in the whole franchise. So here's an interesting thing for comic book fans and new movies coming out. So you know there's a Han Solo movie coming out, right? In the comic book, which is considered canon, which is kind of looks back before Empire and all that, Han Solo has an estranged wife who is black. Will we see her in the movie? I don't know, right? I haven't heard any mention of that, but we'll see. And then, of course, kind of from the same perspective, like, what do our stories look like with a different origin story, right? Because I think most of the time when we're talking, especially when we're talking about like future things, right? And like what the future is based on, we're still basing it on what we look at every day as probably, we're talking about American stories, what we look at every day, right? In terms of what our popularity makeup and everything is like that. Anyone watch The Expanse TV show? I love that show. I love that show. It is diverse in terms of across racial lines, gender lines, sexuality, all these things. But it visualizes this future that is not necessarily completely based on our demographic, right? So it is representative across the whole spectrum. And I think it just succeeds in a lot of different ways that way. So kind of looking past that, and I said, so leading to Expanse, what does the population actually look like in some of these new stories, right? So one of the pushback things I get a lot of time is when I say, hey, I'll watch a TV show now. Actually, here's a great example. Anyone watch Big Little Lies? Big Little Lies? Big Little Lies? I watched it. So I wasn't gonna watch it at first, not because I was protesting it or anything, just I watch too much damn TV as it is. But I wasn't gonna watch it, it just wasn't on my radar. But I cannot stop hearing about people talk about the finale as one of the best things they've ever seen. I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. I'll finally dive in. But it typically might be a show I might not watch because I'm through 3 episodes and I've seen one black person, right? Shows like Mad Men, where we're like, hey, so it took place in up Midtown, New York in the 60s. So of course there weren't a lot of black people. It's like, no, there weren't a lot of black people on the stories you were focusing on, right? So you notice a lot of these like period time shows focus on the affluent population, right? It is very narrow. It is very narrow. Like Masters of Sex does that. Like even, there's a show on AMC about kind of like the birth of like the computer age. Halt and Catch Fire. Is that the name of it? Something like that. Now that diversified a lot more for women as like the season 2 and everything went on. But you'll notice a lot of these period shows are pretty much the same environment, same population, right? Which is like a show like The Get Down is a completely foreign aspect that focuses on, mostly people of color living inner city, that is not like today, right? And then, so I have anyone watch The Get Down? I think it's a good show. I think it's probably more important than it's good, but that's another conversation altogether. And then I touched on this before, like diversity beyond our usual markers, right? Like we kind of have to think bigger, right? It bothers me sometimes because I'm very much in the story and the world building of the story. Anyone that's like a Harry Potter fan, like I'm a Ravenclaw for sure. But it bothers me that like a love story has to be intertwined into something, right? And I get it, like there's some motivational factor for the protagonist or whatever, but that also does not adhere to a sexual perspective in that spectrum, right? Or a romantic, where just like maybe they are just going through life and they don't need this component for the story to work, right? So there are different things that we can like kind of check those boxes in terms of seeing what's important and what is representative to our actual population. Right, and again, touching on that, like language, sexuality, able body. I talked about like the Walking Dead thing in language. And granted, we're English-speaking predominantly audience that is investing most of the TV shows and things that we watch. But we watch a lot of anime, and that is just like straight subtitles. So if we have that many people that are willing to invest in like reading the entertainment that they're watching, then we could do more with language as far as it makes its way into our media. So. And then tradition as a crutch, right? And so that kind of goes back to that notion of, well, Superman can't be black because Superman's never been black before. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? I'm not interested in, preserving things that came before there was any idea or any initiative for having more diversity across that spectrum. It just doesn't translate to what we're trying to do now. To say, well, back in 1940, it wasn't like that. Well, yeah, no shit, right? So as I'm looking at that, kind of beyond that, if I can get there. Yeah, also, make the story weird. Like, so I was talking about the signs thing. Like, why are all aliens have like 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, right? And they just end up being like longer than most of us, right? I'm always disappointed when like there's a movie where there's aliens and they look humanoid. Like, why can't we just do a little bit more than that? Like, I understand that we're trying to make it relatable, but that doesn't feel very alien to me. And Zoe Zendaya cannot be the only black person in space, okay? One, she's not particularly representative of a lot of the politics that I would agree with anyway, but she can't be the only black person that goes to space all the time. So, let's see here. Okay, and so building out that conversation, right? Building out that conversation in terms of how do we look at making things marketable and also making things more inclusive, right? And it comes with a lived experience, or actually an experience that you're trying to pull into your stories, right? So a big topic, especially in movies. So I don't know if anyone saw the new trailer for Detroit, which touches on the riots. It's like the anniversary of the riots. There's some politics around this because I think she's a wonderful director. Catherine Bigelow is directing that. Catherine Bigelow is a white director that's going to be directing, has directed this film, Detroit, which is about in the city, in the uprising and the riots, which is going to be a predominantly black cast. So it speaks to agency. Who gets to tell what story? Under what avenue, what story do they get to tell? And I think the best way to go about that is, how familiar are you with it? What is your objective, right? In terms of who are you trying to represent, right? Are you just trying to add like another Oscar to your, your cabinet? Or are you trying to tell the story of people that you feel is important to you? And if that's the case, then whose input are you getting, right? One of my editors on Black Nerd Problems, Carrie, when we're talking about Game of Thrones, and how Game of Thrones loves and really, really hates women, and how basically her question always is, how many women are in that writer's room? I have no idea, right? I know the main creators, but I don't know how many people know the perspective. And there's always times where there'd be like Game of Thrones, where like there's a video game where something like really, probably unintentionally, but horribly racist turns up in a video game. And the first thing I think is like, man, there's no black people in that writer's room that sell that, right? You know? So I think having this perspective and having a more learned experience and not being afraid to ask. Like for instance, so if a friend of mine makes a video game and they put something in there that I would find offensive, I would much rather than be like, hey, Will, can you take a look at this thing for me? Because I'm trying to be true to this, blah, 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 as opposed to it come out and be like, well, what do you think? I was like, yeah, I think you should have asked me first before you put this out, right? So I think that kind of, that being humble in that notion and realizing that you don't know everything that you want to write on, and actually pulling in those experiences is actually more beneficial because, you might learn something, go figure, right? And then, so of course, just casting a wider net, how to diversify without appropriating, who you're staying true to, who you're interested in getting the perspective of, and basically, what's the purpose of your story, right? Are you just putting in more people from a marginalized community because you think like, oh, this will make my story better, or I'm trying to sell this to this kind of population, or do you see the value in actually diversifying that set and diversifying who's involved? So that's basically my beyond, right? I want to stretch the boxes of the storytelling that we tell now, and how we get there. And I think a lot of that reflects back on, how we conduct ourselves now. So for instance, if we don't make every alien a human, basically, right, then that goes to body politics, right, in terms of what my expectations are and kind of breaking those things down. If not every protagonist that saves the day is a white guy, then maybe we expand our minds to thinking about how we think about people in our everyday lives and what their agency is and what their importance is. So these things kind of reflect back on, from the media and going beyond, but they kind of reflect on kind of how we think about things today. All right. Yes?
Can you talk for like 30 seconds about like the fanfiction world? Because
Yeah.
when I think about like movies
Mm-hmm.
and media, I think about like there's some writer's room in
Mm-hmm.
some like posh Hollywood studio, and
Right.
they're the ones at the top making these decisions,
Mhm.
making this media. But like fan fiction is people like all of us who are like, hey, I think that aliens shouldn't look like that. I think that they should look like big squids.
Right.
Write some story about, you know.
No, so I have a lot of people on the site that have like a fan fiction background. They write a lot of fan fiction, and so there's versions, obviously, and now it's kind of come to fruition. There's versions of like there's fan fiction of Harry Potter with it being like a predominantly black school. And kind of what that looks like in terms of the politics within the school, but the politics in terms of who supports the school, right? So it's a completely different perspective there. But I think that goes, and fan fiction has informed future projects, right? In terms of like, oh, okay, maybe this is possible to do these kind of things. But it plays a big role in expanding upon something that may be beloved and followed. And also giving new perspectives to that. And it comes from usually people with different backgrounds than the person that originated it in the first place. So it's hugely important, and it always sounds so niche, right? But the reality is like, we like these characters, we invest in these characters, and we invest in this world, and fan fiction is a way of injecting a different perspective into those things and kind of breaking out of those boxes and parameters that have already been set. So, yes?
Where do you think, or what do you think is, in terms of priority, looking at the commercialization and commercial success of these stories and storytelling, is it more important to tell original stories that showcase or represent a much more diverse collection of communities, or to take commercial vehicles, commercially accessible vehicles, and rewrite those origins to represent more diversity and a broader spectrum of humanity or thinking?
Yeah. I definitely think there's places for both. Just from my personal perspective, I love an original story. I love something I have not seen or heard before. I like being surprised. Like I ingest enough TV and movies that I know the beats, right? Like I know what's gonna happen. And I went and saw Ghost in the Shell strictly because I needed to review it for the site. We won't even talk about the level of appropriation there. But even like knowing the anime that was Ghost in the Shell, and that it might as well have been inspired by, it wasn't really like a shot for shot. But I just knew, like even knowing it was different from the source, I knew it was gonna happen, right? Because I know, oh yeah, this is a big Hollywood, blockbuster movie, right? Like so in the anime, has a completely different and what would be less fulfilling to a commercialized audience version than the movie does, right? By the end of the anime, she's like, the ghost is in the body of like a 14-year-old girl or something, right? And she has this higher consciousness. So it's like a very good storytelling vehicle. In the movie, it's like, oh, okay, well, I went through this thing and now I'm good now, and now we go on as we were. So I'm a sucker for an original story, just because if we watch enough TV, you know what's gonna happen, right? Like that was like the really cool thing about Game of Thrones. Like, oh my God, they killed a protagonist, right? Like that's not supposed to happen, right? And then like 4 other shows tried to do the same thing after that. But like, and then it became popular to kill off a character early. But so I want an original story, and I think with an original story, it is original. You have the playground, you have the whole sandbox, right? And you don't necessarily have to battle, even though it's not a bad thing to do it. You don't have to battle against the fanboys that don't want to see anything changed, right? But I think the other one is more important too. Is important too, because then you also set a precedent for like, oh, these stories were built from eons ago, and they'll always be that way. And we need to let them know like the culture is changing, and not necessarily. But to answer your question simply, I like an original story. And I think there's just more room to do things there. Yeah.
Okay, so say some big movie exec calls you up and they're like, Will, we think you're the guy for this job. We want you to rewrite the origin story of this superhero. Who would you pick?
Oh man, rewriting the origin story? Man, this is tough. It's tough because I recently put this on Facebook. I asked people, just as a random inquiry, which are you more sick of, seeing the Wayne's parents get murdered or seeing Uncle Ben die, right? And but having said that, if you gave me the opportunity to write Batman as a black family, I do that in a heartbeat. I do that in a heartbeat. Actually, I have the story, right? I would do that in a heartbeat, even though, my God, we don't need any more Batman origin stories. But if we had to do another one,
Is that what's stopping you from doing it?
no, it's not. I know the plate is so full. I'm working through it. No, it's not. It's not stopping me. But if I had the opportunity to write like a new origin for story, it'd probably be Batman, and I would completely. Gotham would look very different. I guess that's the best way I would put it. Gotham would look very different, and there'd be. It very much could look like Columbus. So that's be who I choose. Any other questions? I know we're squeezing the time here, so thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening. Thank you.